In South Philadelphia, there are certain names people don't say out loud, and Ferrante is one of them. Alessio Ferrante was 34 years old, and he'd never once had to raise his voice at anybody. A room went quiet when he walked into it. Men twice his age stood up before he sat down. He owned 4 city blocks, a shipping contract that moved half the port, and that spring, one small tired community bank on Passyunk Avenue. So nobody in that building could have imagined that the security guard standing at the front gate every morning at 20 minutes to 7, in a faded uniform 2 sizes too big, a torn sleeve, cheap black shoes, and a flip phone held together with tape, was the man who signed every paycheck inside. The head teller and 2 of her friends came through that gate at 8 every morning, and every morning they made a little game out of him. One of them would point. The other 2 would start laughing before she'd even said a word. That's him. High school diploma and a whistle. One morning she threw a $20 bill at his chest and told him to go get their coffee. And when he said no, she looked him up and down and said, "You're awfully proud for a man with nothing." Then the 3 of them walked inside laughing, right past a man who could have bought every house on their street before lunch. He didn't answer her. He never answered any of them. He just stood there in the heat and took it, because he hadn't come to that gate for respect. He'd come looking for the answer to a question that all his money had never once been able to buy him, and on the 9th morning, he finally got it. From the one person in that whole building nobody ever bothered to look at twice. Before we begin, if stories about dignity and about the people we walk past every day, without ever really seeing them mean something to you, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Share it with someone who could use a story like this today. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss one. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning in South Philadelphia, to a gate, a faded uniform, and the 9 days that changed everything. The brownstone house on Mifflin Street woke before the city did. Dawn had not fully broken, and dew still clung to the front steps. Yet 7 men were already sitting in the parlor, each in his own chair, no one speaking loudly, no one crossing his legs. They had come from different hours and different places, but every one of them had arrived early, because no one came late to this house. A pot of coffee sat cold on the table, and not one man dared pour himself a cup. When footsteps sounded on the staircase, all 7 rose almost at once, and they remained standing until Alessio Ferrante pulled out a chair and sat down. He passed the kitchen, where 3 people had been laughing about something, and the laughter died in the middle of a sentence, not because they feared being scolded, but because the silence that followed him carried a weight of its own, a weight no one in that house could explain, though every one of them could feel it. He nodded to each man, called each one by name, even the youngest, who had only been working for the family for a few months, and that was the thing that made them cherish him and fear him more than anything else. The first man summoned inside was around 50, holding his hat in both hands, sweat gathering at his temples even though the morning was still cold. He had come to ask for more time. He had prepared a long speech, complete with reasons, explanations, and promises. Alessio didn't let him finish. He stood, took a clean cup, poured hot coffee into it, set it in front of the man, then asked about the man's daughter, using the girl's name, asked how her final examinations had gone, asked whether she still wanted to study medicine as she once had. The man went still. He hadn't expected Alessio to remember. He stammered that she had done well, that she still wanted to become a doctor, that she was the hardest working child in the family. Alessio nodded and said that was good, that a child who studied hard shouldn't have to worry about the affairs of grown men. Then he said, very softly, so softly that the man, sitting only a few steps away, had to tilt his head to hear, that he had 3 more weeks, and that he shouldn't make Alessio remember this matter a second time. There wasn't a single threat in those words, not one harsh syllable. The man thanked him profusely, thanked him 3 or 4 times, bent low in farewell, then back toward the door, and when he reached the front steps, the ring of keys in his hand fell against the stone with a dry, sharp sound, because his hand was trembling too badly to hold on to it. Salvatore Ricci stood in the corner of the room with a file tucked against his chest, watching until the man disappeared from sight. He had served as attorney to this family since Alessio's father was still young, had sat in that room longer than most of the men present that morning had been alive, and he knew exactly what he had just witnessed. He waited until everyone else had gone before speaking, saying that in the old days Alessio's father would have shouted, would have slammed his fist on the table, would have left a crack in the air that people could still smell a week later. Alessio replied that no one had ever called his father by his name either. Sal gave a quiet laugh, placed the file on the table, and finally said aloud what he had carried in his mind for years, that Alessio's father had been the face, while Alessio was the name, that the old man had arranged it that way deliberately from the time Alessio was a child, that he used to say the boy had to become the name, not the face, because a name couldn't be recognized on the street, and no one could put handcuffs around it. Alessio said nothing. He looked out the window, where people were beginning to move along the narrow street, people rising early for the first shift, people carrying paper bags filled with bread, people who would live their entire lives without ever knowing what had just taken place inside that brownstone house. Sal pushed the file toward him and said the deal was done, that the community bank on Passyunk Avenue now belonged to the family, that the introduction of the new owner would be arranged within the next few weeks, that this was the first step toward bringing the name into the light, exactly as Alessio's father had instructed before his death. Alessio opened the file, turned several pages, and stopped at the list of employees. He didn't ask about the profits. He didn't ask about the board of directors. He didn't ask about a single figure. He looked up and asked a question that left Salvatore Ricci standing motionless in the middle of the room, a pen still in his hand, with no idea how to answer. He asked who cleaned the floors in that building. Not far away, in Kensington, inside a third-floor apartment in a building without an elevator, Marisol Reyes had been awake since before a single streetlight had gone dark. She rose before the alarm sounded, as she had every morning for the past 2 years, and lay still for a few seconds in the darkness to make sure she hadn't awakened anyone else in the apartment. There were 3 places where the wooden floor creaked, and she knew all 3 by heart, so she stepped around them along a path known only to her. She heated water, made a cup of ginger tea for her mother, then sat at the kitchen table and sorted the medicine bag, dividing each blister pack by day and fastening rubber bands around the ones meant for the morning so her mother wouldn't get confused. A small calendar was taped to the refrigerator door, crowded with circles drawn in ink. She traced each square with her fingertip, checking everything once more to be certain, then folded the appointment slip and slipped it into her mother's purse. Isabel came out while steam was still rising from the kettle. She sat down, drank the tea in small sips, then began the task she performed every morning and never allowed herself to do carelessly. She took the old blue scarf from the drawer, its edges worn thin, folded it in half, draped it around her neck, adjusted the ends until they hung evenly, then studied herself in the mirror beside the door and fixed it once again. Marisol told her she was only going to the hospital and could wear anything she pleased. Isabel replied that even a hospital visit required a person to look respectable, that people treated you according to how they saw you, and that she didn't want anyone at the clinic thinking she was an old woman with no one left to care for her. Marisol didn't argue. She simply stepped closer, straightened one crooked corner of the scarf, then turned away quickly so her mother wouldn't see her eyes. In the corner of the room, beneath the only desk lamp still glowing, Javi sat studying, 15 years old, his hair sticking up on one side from sleep, his notebook open before him, and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up at his sister, then toward the dark window, and remarked that she left for work so early she met the sun before the roosters did. Isabel laughed, and the laugh made her cough once, but then she kept laughing. Marisol ruffled the boy's hair and told him to worry about his lessons before the teacher asked him something the next day and caught him sitting there chewing on his pencil again. He cried out that she had ruined his hair, and all 3 of them laughed together in the small kitchen, that warm sound filling the apartment for a few brief seconds before everything fell quiet again. Once her mother and brother had gone back inside, Marisol opened the lowest cabinet and took out a dented tin that had once held cookies. She set it on the table, lifted the lid, and counted. She counted slowly, counted twice, then counted a 3rd time, as though the 3rd count might somehow produce a different answer. It was still not enough. Not enough for the rent, not enough for Javi's tuition the following term, and not enough for her share of the clinic appointment the next week. She sat still for a while with both hands resting on the lid, then closed the tin, returned it to its hiding place, and said nothing to anyone. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, kissed her mother's forehead, reminded Javi to lock the door carefully, then descended 3 dark flights of stairs. Outside, the wind was still cold, and the city was still half asleep. She walked toward the bus stop along the familiar route, passing the closed laundromat, the green-painted iron fence, and the small church on the corner. That morning, A funeral had gathered outside the church, only a handful of people standing close together, a black car parked against the curb, and a casket being carried out. Marisol turned her face away at once, quickened her pace, and kept her eyes fixed on the sidewalk until she had passed the corner. 2 years had gone by, and she still couldn't bear the sight of a coffin. On the bus, she sat in the last seat, rested her head against the window, and for those brief 15 minutes allowed herself to close her eyes, because it would be the longest rest she would have until night. She would finish cleaning the building before the people in white shirts arrived, and that evening, she would stand washing dishes at a restaurant a few blocks away until closing time. Some people were born to leave. Marisol had never been allowed to leave. She only ran. That afternoon, after the last of the men had left the house on Mifflin Street, Alessio drove alone to the cemetery at the southern edge of the city. He stopped at the small flower shop on the corner near the gate and bought a bouquet of the cheapest white chrysanthemums, the kind his mother used to place in a glass vase on the windowsill when she was alive, and the old woman behind the counter wrapped them in newspaper because she had never once realized who he was. He walked inside, past rows of headstones standing in perfect lines, until he reached a grave in the third row from the path, no larger and no smaller than the graves around it, though he had more than enough power to make it different. He had once offered to raise a marble headstone for her, and while she was still lying in her sickbed, she had forbidden him to do it, telling him that if she was going to rest beside her old neighbors, she didn't want to look any different from them. He set the flowers down, brushed the dry leaves from the stone, then remained crouched there for a long time without saying a word. His mother, Rosaria, had cleaned the hallways of a large bank in Center City for more than 20 years. Every morning, she left home before dawn, took 2 buses, and returned after he had already fallen asleep. She knew the name of every person in that building. She knew which elderly security guard's knees ached when the weather turned cold, which secretary had just given birth, which vice president liked his coffee without sugar, and often left his glasses behind on the conference table. She remembered everything. She spoke of them at the dinner table as though she were speaking of old acquaintances. Then, on the day she retired, they called her into the personnel office, shook her hand, and gave her a card signed by the entire department, the signatures crowded together across both sides of the paper. On that card, her name was spelled wrong. Not a single letter misplaced, but an entirely different name. She brought the card home, set it on the table, and her son, barely in his 20s then, sprang to his feet and said things he would never repeat afterward. She only took him by the hand and pulled him back into his chair, smoothed the card flat with her calloused palm, and said, "They don't hate me, son. They just never saw me." She said it so calmly that the words remained inside him longer than anything else she had ever said. When darkness began to fall, he returned home, went upstairs, opened the bottom drawer where he kept the things no one else was allowed to touch, and took out that card. Its 4 corners had yellowed. The ink of several signatures had begun to blur. He had kept it all those years, through every move, through all the years in which he had learned how to make grown men drop their keys because their hands were trembling. He opened it and read the wrong name again, slowly, as though this time it might somehow be different. He thought of everything he had built, the blocks that carried his name in ledgers, the contracts that a single phone call from him could make men lose sleep over for an entire week, the rooms that fell silent whenever he entered. He thought about how, through all those years, no one had ever looked at him without thinking of the name he carried, without thinking of what he could do for them, or what he could do to them. And he realized that what had happened to his mother inside that building, in a very different way, was happening to him every day. People hadn't seen her because she carried a mop. People didn't see him because he carried the Ferrante name. He had spent his entire life learning how to make people fear him. He had never learned how to make them see him. He returned the card to the drawer just before a knock sounded at the door, because he had arranged for Camilla Sarto to come that evening. She walked in as she always did, beautiful and self-assured, set her handbag on a chair, and asked why he had been calling so rarely lately. He didn't answer that question. He simply placed 2 things on the table. The first was a small velvet box he had bought the previous winter and had never found the right moment to open in front of her. The second was a metal recording device no larger than a matchbox, the one she kept hidden inside the lining of her handbag. She looked down at the table. Her face didn't go pale at once. The color drained from it slowly, little by little, like water pulling away from the shore. He remained seated, didn't raise his voice, didn't strike the table with his hand, didn't ask why. He only said that she hadn't betrayed him, because betrayal belonged to people who had feelings, while she had merely taken him to market, and he was only curious how much they had paid her. She opened her mouth to speak. He rose before she could make the first sound, slipped the velvet box into his coat pocket, left the recording device on the table, and went upstairs without looking back. The entire exchange lasted no more than a few minutes, and when she walked out the door, no one in the house saw her off. It was the last time he saw her for many months, and he believed the matter had ended there. 3 days later, something else happened at the docks. A Ferrante family shipment was waiting to be unloaded when the contract was canceled midway. The paperwork was held back. 2 longtime partners suddenly changed their minds in the same morning, and the person behind it made no effort to hide because they wanted the entire harbor to know who had acted. The DeLucci family had aimed at what they believed was a weak place, because Alessio's father had just died, because they believed the son wasn't hard enough yet. Frankie Bruno offered to send men down there to talk. Alessio told him to sit down. He didn't send anyone anywhere. That afternoon, he stayed in his office and made 4 phone calls, none lasting more than a few minutes, his voice still as gentle as when he asked how another man's daughter had done on her examinations. Over the next 2 days, things began collapsing on the other side of the city without a single person having to leave home. The business licenses of several DeLucci restaurants were suspended over violations that had existed for years and that someone had suddenly decided to read. A bank called to demand early repayment of a loan that wasn't supposed to come due for many years. A food supplier stopped deliveries because of outstanding debt, though that debt had been there for years without anyone mentioning it. And a district councilman who had dined with that family no fewer than a dozen times suddenly stopped answering his phone, didn't return calls, and had his secretary say he would be busy all week. No doors were kicked in, no one was threatened. There were only phone calls, and the things that had already been rotten simply gave way. Sal Ricci read the summary, set the paper down on the table, removed his glasses to clean them, and said that Alessio had just cost dozens of people, their jobs, waiters, dishwashers, people who had nothing to do with what happened at the docks. Alessio answered that no, Mr. DeLucci had cost them their jobs. He knew exactly who he was playing with, and he played anyway, while Alessio had merely sent the bill to the correct address. Sal didn't reply at once. He put his glasses back on and studied the man sitting before him for a long time, so long that Alessio finally had to look up. Then he said that Alessio was becoming more like his father every day, and he wasn't sure that was a compliment. Alessio was about to answer, but then he said nothing. He thought of the drawer upstairs, of the yellowing card resting inside it, of the woman who had told him not to build her a headstone different from those of her neighbors, and he remained silent until Sal gathered his papers and left. The following Monday morning, Sal Ricci returned to the house on Mifflin Street, carrying the Fairhaven Bank appraisal file, and this time, he spread its contents across the entire dining table. He said he had people examine every line, that the branch's records were so clean they were almost impossible to believe. No losses, no discrepancies, not a single account off by more than a few cents over several consecutive years. But there was one thing the books couldn't explain. In less than 2 years, the branch had lost hundreds of elderly customers. They withdrew their money, closed their accounts, and left. Sal said he had been in this business long enough to know that old people didn't change banks. They stayed loyal to the place where they had deposited their first paychecks. They knew the counter, the smell, the waiting chairs, and they remained there until remaining was no longer possible. Yet these people had left one after another. No one filed a lawsuit. No one caused a scene. They simply disappeared in silence. Alessio sat without speaking, studying the page filled with columns of figures for a long time, then said that when the books were too clean, they weren't clean books. They were books someone had cleaned. Sal nodded and proposed the usual approach, sending in an independent audit team to examine everything, which should uncover the truth within a few weeks. Alessio rejected the idea immediately. He said that if they sent auditors inside, whoever was doing this would know by the end of the morning. That person would lie still for several months. The books would become even cleaner, and once the auditors left, it would begin again. Only next time the person would be smarter. He said he didn't need someone with authority. He needed someone invisible, someone who could remain inside that building for 8 hours every day without anyone bothering to notice. Someone no one watched their words around as they passed, someone no one lowered their voice in front of. He said that inside a building like that, no one was more invisible than the doorman and the person who cleaned the floors. Sal set down his pen. Frankie Bruno, who had been leaning against the wall the entire time, blurted out that a boss couldn't stand around guarding a door, that if word of this got out, the family name wouldn't mean anything anymore, that the whole city would laugh in their faces. Alessio turned to look at him and replied that his father had started as a dock worker, that he had carried cargo until his back could no longer straighten, and that if the family name could die simply because Alessio stood watch over a gate, then it had already been dead for a very long time. Frankie fell silent. Sal remained seated for a long while, turning the pen between two fingers, then said he would help, but only on one condition, and he wanted to state that condition while someone else was present to witness it. He looked directly into Alessio's eyes and said that Alessio was going in there to find a thief, not to test the character of the world, that the moment this game hurt an innocent person, someone who had nothing to do with his affairs, he would stop immediately, and there would be no negotiation, no explanation, and no exceptions. Alessio agreed. The preparations took 2 days. His watch was removed and placed in a drawer. His car remained in the garage, and no one was allowed to take it out. He moved into a rented room a few blocks from the bank, and the only possession he brought with him was a cloth bag. Sal created an employment file for him under the name Alfaro, a former soldier with no debts, no criminal record, no social media accounts, and no address he had kept for more than a few years, a file so neat and so empty that even Sal congratulated himself on how beautifully he had made it. At last, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old flip phone, its screen split by a thin crack and its hinge wrapped with a strip of tape. He placed it in Alessio's hand and said, "Welcome to the life the rest of humanity lives." Alessio flipped the phone open, listened to its dry little click, slipped it into his pants pocket, and said nothing more. The first week passed more slowly than any week he had ever lived through. The man assigned to train him was Ray Alvarez, the head of security, a man with hair streaked with gray, a straight back, and a way of speaking in which every word seemed to stand exactly where it belonged. He taught Alessio everything in the proper order, exactly as the handbook required. He showed him how to inspect employee badges, how to record visitors' names in the logbook, how to direct vehicles entering and leaving the property, how to keep watch over the emergency exit without abandoning his post, and how to help an elderly person across the front steps when necessary. At the end of that first shift, Ray closed the book, studied him for a moment, then said that the job was easy, but the people were difficult. Alessio asked what he meant. Ray only shrugged and said he would understand soon enough, that a few days standing at that gate would teach him everything. Alessio understood very quickly. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the same group of people walked past him, carrying the same laughter and repeating the same jokes they believed he wasn't important enough to hear. He didn't respond. He wrote in the logbook, opened the gate, closed the gate, and remained at his post. But the most memorable thing that happened that week didn't come from their laughter. It came from a car. On Thursday afternoon, a gray car pulled in and stopped directly across the yellow-painted area leading to the emergency exit on the side of the building, blocking the entire space. The man who stepped out was Garrett Doyle, the branch operations manager, carrying a briefcase and speaking on his phone as he walked. Alessio approached him and said politely, "Sir, this is an emergency exit. Please move your car to the rear parking area." Garrett didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He merely flicked one hand as though brushing away a fly and continued inside. Half an hour later, Walter Nash, the head of the lending department, came out into the courtyard, saw the car blocking the exit, and asked who had parked there. Garrett happened to be walking out at that very moment, and without taking even a second to think, he said the new guard had waved him into the space because he didn't understand the rules yet. Everyone in the courtyard turned toward Alessio. He could have said 10 things in that moment. He said only one, in an ordinary voice no louder than the wind. "There is a camera there, sir." The air seemed to stop for a single beat. Garrett turned and looked at him, and for the first time, he truly saw him. He wasn't looking at a uniform anymore. He was looking into Alessio's face with the eyes of a man calculating very quickly how far he had just stepped into empty space. Then Garrett forced a laugh and said he would move the car, that there must have been some misunderstanding. And he did move it. Walter Nash gave Alessio a single nod before going inside. No one apologized. But from that day forward, every time Garrett Doyle passed the gate, he cast one quick glance in Alessio's direction, and it wasn't the kind of glance people gave a doorman. On the final afternoon of that first week, the sunlight was fierce, the heat striking the concrete courtyard and rising back against his face. He remained at his post from after lunch until the shift changed, because the man replacing him had called to say he would be late, and Alessio didn't leave his position. By the time the sunlight had shifted completely to the other side of the street, the back of his shirt was soaked through and clinging to his skin, and both calves had gone stiff. He thought of all the air-conditioned rooms where he had sat through so many years, the leather chairs, the cups of coffee brought to him without his ever having to stand. He thought that there were some things no one could understand by reading a report. When he signed the shift log and walked away, Ray Alvarez stood on the front steps and watched him for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask a question, offer praise, or give a warning. He simply stood there with his arms folded across his chest, watching the man disappear around the corner. Then Ray turned back inside, went down to the lower floor, opened the maintenance room, and took out a small camera still sealed in its box. He set up a ladder, mounted the camera on the hallway ceiling, aimed it directly at the server room door, connected the wires, tested the signal, then wrote a brief line in his work log, stating that additional surveillance equipment had been installed in the technical area in accordance with procedure. He closed the book and told no one. The next morning was stiflingly hot, the sun beating down on the concrete courtyard without a break. As Marisol pushed her cleaning cart past the front gate, she noticed the security guard standing motionless under the heat, his faded shirt soaked with sweat. Without saying a word, she reached into her cart, took out a sealed bottle of cold water, handed it to him through the gate bars, and walked away before he could even process what had happened. The bottle of water was still cold in his hand when she disappeared around the corner, and he remained there, holding it, watching her small figure for longer than necessary. She didn't stop and wait for him to thank her. She didn't turn around to see whether he drank it. She simply picked up her bucket and continued on as though she had done nothing worth remembering, and that was precisely what made it impossible for him to look away. At noon, when Ray Alvarez came out to relieve him, Alessio asked the name of the woman from the cleaning staff who often passed through that way. Ray frowned for a moment and genuinely tried to remember, as though searching for something he had never bothered to store in the first place, then shook his head and said, "You mean the woman who cleans the floors? I don't really know her name." He added in a calm voice, without any cruelty in it, that no one there called those people by name anyway. They just said the cleaning woman, the sanitation staff, the people who clean, because it was quicker that way. Then he patted Alessio on the shoulder and told him to go eat before his lunch break was over. Alessio remained there for a while longer, still holding the bottle, which had begun to bead with moisture, and he could no longer hear the traffic outside. He had spent decades turning his own name into something people didn't dare speak loudly. Yet inside that building, there were people who moved through broad daylight whose names had never once been spoken by anyone. Down in the basement, Bev Kaminsky was handing out uniforms for the morning shift, her hands moving quickly as she folded each set while giving instructions to every worker. She handed Marisol a new shirt and said the old one was worn thin at the shoulders, that she should wear this one and look presentable. Chelsea Novak, the youngest woman on the crew, was standing before the mirror beside the lockers, touching up her lipstick and boasting that she had caught the attention of a manager upstairs, that he had passed her twice that week and looked at her both times. She turned toward Marisol, looked her up and down, then asked whether she had come there looking for work or looking for a husband, because dressed the way she was, even the security guard wouldn't bother to look at her. Marisol was tying back her hair. She didn't lift her head. She only said that she came to work for a paycheck. Chelsea gave a scornful laugh and told her she would find out soon enough. Bev tapped her notebook lightly against the side of a locker and told them both to get upstairs before they were late. And the matter ended there. That morning, Marisol finished cleaning the waiting area before the customers began to crowd in. She cleaned it carefully, stepped back to inspect it once, then pushed her cart toward another section. Less than 10 minutes later, Brianna Cole called sharply across the lobby, pointed down at the tile, and said there was still a streak there, and she needed to clean it again. Marisol came back and cleaned it a second time. She had barely put away the cloth when Brianna called her again, louder this time, loudly enough to make several waiting customers look up, and said, "I just told you there was still a streak. Are you listening to me?" Marisol cleaned it for the third time. She didn't argue once. She bent down, wiped the exact place Brianna had indicated, stood up, then asked in an ordinary voice whether she would please check and see if it was all right now. Brianna didn't even bother to look at the floor. She merely waved one hand and said it was fine, told her to go, then turned to the person beside her and said something that made them both laugh. Everyone in the lobby understood that what had just happened had nothing to do with a streak of water on the floor. It was only a way of reminding everyone who gave the orders and who had to bend down. Alessio saw the entire thing through the glass doors. He saw her kneel for the third time. He saw her rise and ask again, in a voice that was still polite, and he thought of the bottle of water resting beneath the chair in the security booth, the one he still hadn't opened. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that all he had to do was lift the old flip phone from his pocket and say a single sentence, and the life of the woman who had just shouted at her across the lobby would change before nightfall. She knew nothing at all. She had only seen that he was thirsty. And that was the first time in his life anyone had seen him without seeing the name he carried. The following Tuesday morning, an elderly woman entered the bank, carrying a cloth bag in one hand and a stack of papers pressed tightly against her chest, as though she were holding something precious. Her name was Eunice Hartley. She was well into her 70s, with a slightly stooped back, low-heeled shoes, and a blouse buttoned all the way to the neck, and she waited in line from the beginning until her turn came without making a single complaint. When she reached the counter, she placed the papers on the glass and began spreading them out. They were bank statements that had been folded and unfolded many times, their edges curled, some with handwritten notes in ink along the margins, others held together by paper clips that had begun to rust. She explained that every month a little money was missing from her pension. Not much, but something was missing every month, and she had been forced to stop taking one of her medications to make up the difference. She said she had spent several evenings at home, adding the figures again and again. Brianna Cole glanced over the papers, a glance that lasted less than 2 seconds, then gently pushed the statements back toward her and said, "Ma'am, take these home, put them in proper order, and come back another time. There are many other customers waiting." Mrs. Hartley stood still. She tried to add one more sentence, saying, "I wrote all my notes right here, dear," but Brianna had already looked up and called the next number. The elderly woman gathered her papers, dropped one because her hands were trembling, bent down to retrieve it, then stepped out of the line and stopped in the middle of the lobby. She didn't walk toward the door. She simply stood there, clutching the stack of papers, and began to cry. She didn't cry aloud. She only stood there, while tears ran down both sides of her deeply lined face, and she took out a handkerchief and dabbed at them quickly, as though afraid someone might notice. She wasn't crying because of the money. She was crying because all week she had been wondering whether she had become confused, whether her own mind could no longer be trusted, and that morning someone had spoken to her as though those fears were true. Marisol was cleaning the nearby hallway. She leaned her mop against the wall, removed her rubber gloves, walked over, and helped the elderly woman to a chair in the corner of the lobby. She sat beside her and didn't ask how much money she had lost. She only asked whether Mrs. Hartley would let her look at the papers. Then she began arranging each statement by date, placing the older ones underneath and the newer ones on top, smoothing the folds and stacking them neatly across her lap. She read slowly, tracing each line with her finger, and on 3 consecutive statements, she stopped at the same place. A fee appeared every month, always under the same name and for the same amount, so small that no one would bother to notice it, yet it remained there month after month, patient as a dripping faucet. She pointed it out to the elderly woman and said, "Look here, ma'am. Right here. It appears every month." Mrs. Hartley bent down to look, then raised her eyes to Marisol, and they turned red once more. She said, "I spent my whole life teaching children how to read and count. I stood in a classroom until chalk wore my fingernails down, and this morning they spoke to me as though I couldn't even read my own numbers anymore." Marisol placed her hand over the woman's and said, "You read them correctly. You aren't confused. They simply didn't want to listen." Walter Nash crossed the lobby carrying a file. He slowed his steps, then stopped completely several feet away and listened, though no one noticed him. Outside the glass doors, Alessio stood at his post with his back to the street, and he heard every word. Before leaving, Mrs. Hartley took Marisol's hand and held it tightly, the way someone clings to a life preserver, then lowered her voice and asked, "Dear, are you free this Thursday evening? My friends and I often meet at the community center on Snyder Street." Then she spoke even more softly and added, "It isn't only me, dear. Several other people have noticed strange things too, but none of us knows whom to ask." At the end of that afternoon, Marisol asked to speak with Garrett Doyle. She had prepared in advance, copying those entries onto a sheet of graph paper. clearly noting which month each charge appeared, what kind of charge it was, and how many times it had been repeated, and she stood in the hallway waiting for nearly half an hour before she was called inside. He invited her to sit, which she hadn't expected. He even pushed a glass of water toward her. Then he leaned back in his chair and listened with careful attention, nodding in the right places, occasionally murmuring his agreement, lifting the paper to glance over it before setting it down again, and asking several questions as though he genuinely cared. She finished speaking. He remained silent for a few seconds, then smiled, the gentle smile of a man about to explain something simple to a child. He said she had a strong sense of responsibility, and that was a good thing, but she had misunderstood how service fees worked. He launched into a long explanation about maintenance fees, processing fees, reconciliation fees, using terms he knew perfectly well she had no way to verify, then concluded that this was standard practice in the industry, and anyone who had worked there long enough understood it. She said, "But sir, these charges only appear in the accounts of elderly customers." He nodded thoughtfully and told her he would have someone review them, that she shouldn't worry. Then, after she had risen, the paper in her hand, and had nearly reached the door, he called after her in a very mild voice and asked whether the cleaning company's contract was about to expire, saying he believed it was due for renewal at the end of the quarter. She stopped. He was still smiling, still looking down at his desk, his hands straightening several sheets of paper. She said, "Yes, sir, I believe so." He told her to keep doing her job well and everything would work itself out. She left the office, and the sheet of graph paper in her hand had crumpled because she was gripping it too tightly. That night, after nearly all the lights in the building had been turned off, Garrett Doyle remained in his office. He didn't review a single fee. He opened the personnel system, typed the name Al Farrow into the search field, and sat reading for a very long time. The file made him uneasy from the very first line. No debt, no criminal record, not a single social media account, no address held for more than a few years, no relative listed as a reference. A man of that age, back from military service, unemployed for a time, yet with a history as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. He read it a second time, then a third, and then he remembered that Thursday afternoon, remembered the calm voice saying, "There is a camera there, sir," and remembered the way the man hadn't shown the slightest confusion when he was blamed in front of a superior. An ordinary man would have argued. An ordinary man would have been afraid. Garrett reached for the phone and called an old friend, and when the other man answered, his voice was already trembling. He said, "The guard at my place is federal. I'm sure of it. Nobody has a record that clean. You understand what I'm saying? They planted him here." The man on the other end asked something. Garrett fell silent for a moment, then said, "I have to finish dealing with a few loose ends. Fast. As fast as possible." Outside in the hallway, only a few steps from that door, Alessio stood motionless in the darkness. He had been making the final rounds before locking up, and he had heard everything. Inside his pants pocket, his hand tightened around the old flip phone. All he had to do was open it, make one call lasting less than a minute, and by the following morning, the man trembling inside that office would have no job, no home, and not a single door in the city willing to open for him again. He held the phone so long that his palm grew warm. Then he released it. If he dealt with this man in the way he knew best, the matter would be over within a week, and he would never discover who inside that building stood on which side. 2 days later, in the middle of the busiest morning of the week, a loud voice rang out from the far end of the lobby. A sum of money that had just been counted for transfer into the vault was no longer complete, and the person who discovered it was Garrett Doyle himself. He strode into the center of the lobby, his voice carrying loudly enough to make everyone in the waiting area look up, and pointed toward the gate where Alessio was standing. He said that only one new person had passed through that hallway that morning, and he wanted the man searched right there, right then, in front of everyone, so the matter could be made clear. The entire lobby fell silent. Several customers lowered their eyes toward their handbags. Alessio stepped inside. He didn't argue. He didn't retreat. He stood straight with his arms resting at his sides and asked in a voice so quiet that those farther away had to lean forward to hear, "You decided I was guilty before I had the chance to open my mouth. I only want to know why." Garrett shouted that he shouldn't use that tone with him. Then the wheels of a cleaning cart stopped. Marisol stepped out from the line, still holding a cleaning cloth, and said that there was a camera in that hallway, so why didn't they review the footage before dragging a man out to be searched in front of a crowd? Brianna Cole spun around and said that she was a janitor. So what business did she have speaking here? Marisol didn't take a single step back. She replied, I'm the only person in this room suggesting that we examine the evidence. No one could say anything after that. Outside the glass doors, on the sidewalk across the street, a black car had pulled over at some point. Frankie Bruno stood beside it, one hand resting on the handle of the building's glass door, his body leaning slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the scene inside. He had been there long enough to hear everything. He was waiting for only one nod. Alessio turned his head for less than a second, their eyes meeting through the glass, and he shook his head, so slightly that not one person in the entire building noticed. Frankie released the door handle. He stepped back, opened the car door, climbed inside, and the vehicle drove away. Garrett Doyle stood only a few feet away, still raising his voice, never knowing that in that brief moment his life had passed through a narrow opening he would never even realize had been there. Ray Alvarez appeared carrying the keys to the surveillance room and said they could go downstairs to review the footage because the hallway camera had been operating normally. The entire group went down to the lower floor. The recording showed Alessio walking through the hallway, placing a packet of documents on the reception desk, pausing for no more than a few seconds, then turning and leaving. After that, it showed another employee carrying the envelope of money into the inner room and forgetting to record it in the transfer log. That was all there was to it. The money was exactly where it belonged. It had simply been entered in the wrong place. Garrett stared at the screen for a moment, then stood, brushed off his sleeves, and said, All right, it was only a small mistake. Anyone who works in a bank has moments like this. He walked out without saying a single word to Alessio. No one apologized. Ray Alvarez took out his duty log, sat at the desk, and recorded the entire incident, including the time, the name of the person who had demanded the search, and the result of the video review, then signed his name at the bottom of the page. He closed the book, placed it in a drawer, locked it, and still said nothing to anyone. That afternoon, in the parking lot behind the building, Alessio found Marisol pouring a bucket of dirty water into the drain. He thanked her. She said it was nothing. He asked whether she wasn't afraid of that man. She stopped what she was doing, straightened, and looked toward the road. She remained silent for a long time before answering. She said, Of course I'm afraid. Very afraid. I'll probably lose sleep over it tonight. Then she continued more slowly. But I stayed silent once before, and that person isn't here anymore for me to make up for it now. She picked up the bucket and went back inside without offering any further explanation, and Alessio remained in the parking lot for a very long time after the door had closed. By the second month, on a weekday morning, Marisol's phone began to vibrate while she was wiping down the second-floor hallway. The person on the other end was a receptionist from the clinic. She said that Isabel's appointment that afternoon couldn't go forward because the previous month's medical bill still hadn't been paid, that they were very sorry, that rules were rules, and that if the family could make the payment that day, they would reschedule the appointment. Marisol stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, hearing the woman speak without being able to make sense of the words. She called the cleaning company and asked for an advance on part of her wages. The supervisor told her that she hadn't been employed long enough, that the company had no precedent for advancing wages to new workers, and that he hoped she would understand. She went downstairs and asked Bev Kaminsky. Bev reached into her pocket and gave Marisol everything she had, and both women knew it wasn't enough. Then Marisol did something she would never normally have done. She went up to the main lobby, approached the counter, and asked whether the bank had any kind of emergency assistance fund for employees. Brianna Cole looked up at her and laughed, a short, sharp laugh, then said that this was a bank, not a church. Two customers turned to look. Marisol thanked her and walked away. Alessio had been standing outside the gate the entire time. He had heard everything. When she passed him, he called her back, then took all the money he had from his pants pocket. It was the security guard's pay he had received only a few days earlier. Several bills folded in half. Not much, but everything a man named Alfaro owned in the world. He held it out to her. She stepped back and said she couldn't take it, that this was his salary, and he still had to live. He kept his hand where it was. Then he said calmly, I'll be paid again next month. Your mother might not have another week. She stood motionless. Her eyes turned red, but she didn't cry. She accepted the money and said, I'll pay you back, every last cent. He nodded and said, I know. Less than half an hour later, Walter Nash called her into his office. He had heard what happened from Bev. He didn't ask many questions. He simply opened a drawer, took out a form, filled it in by hand, signed it, stamped it, then told her to take it down to the finance office. He approved an advance intended for contracted employees, even though under the rules he had no authority to approve such a payment for an outside worker. She asked whether this would cause trouble for him. He closed the drawer and said, "If anyone asks, I'll take responsibility. Go now, before you're late." That afternoon, Isabel still made it to her appointment. That night, Marisol sat on a plastic chair in the clinic hallway, with her back against the wall, waiting until it was time to take her mother home. She called Javi to remind him to lock the door and go to bed early. While they were talking, the boy hesitated for a while before admitting that he had stopped by the bakery at the end of the street that afternoon to ask whether they needed someone to help clear tables on weekends, only for 2 mornings, Saturday and Sunday, and that he would still have time to study after school. He spoke quickly, as though he were afraid she would scold him. Marisol fell silent for several seconds, and during those seconds, she had to raise one hand to cover her mouth. Then she said, "You just focus on school. Earning money is my job." Javi protested. "But you're already so tired," she replied. "Being tired is my problem. All I need from you is to study hard. That's how you pay me back." The boy went quiet for a while, then said all right, and wished her good night, even though he knew perfectly well she wouldn't be sleeping for a long time. She ended the call, and remained seated for a very long time in that brightly lit white hallway, both hands wrapped around her elbows. At midnight, in a rented room several blocks from the bank, Alessio sat on the edge of the bed, flipped open the old phone, and dialed a number. The call lasted less than a minute. He said a few words, listened to a few words, then closed the phone and placed it on the table. The next morning, the clinic called Marisol to inform her that Isabel's case had just been accepted into a medical assistance program, and that from then on, the family would only have to pay a small portion of the cost. She asked them 3 times, to make sure. They told her it was true, that the application had already been approved. She thanked them, ended the call, and stood alone in the stairwell, crying. That Friday afternoon, Camilla Sarto was walking along Passyunk Avenue. She had come to the neighborhood to look at a property for an art gallery, and she had already passed the gate by several steps when she stopped abruptly. She took half a step back, tilted her head, and stared. The man guarding the gate was bent over the logbook, writing down a visitor's name, dressed in a faded uniform with a tear along one elbow. She had once stood across from that same man in a room where a velvet box and a recording device rested on the table between them. She couldn't possibly be mistaken. She didn't call out. She didn't approach him. She merely slipped beneath the awning of a laundromat across the street, took out her phone, raised it, and snapped a photograph. Then she put the phone away, pulled up the collar of her coat, and continued walking as though she had merely photographed a storefront sign. 3 days later, inside a private dining room at a restaurant in North Philadelphia, a man from the DeLucci family placed a printed copy of the photograph on the table and turned it around so the others could see it clearly. No car, no one accompanying him. The same place, the same hours, every single day. Someone suggested handling it the way they had always handled such things. The man at the head of the table dismissed the idea. He said that if they touched him, the entire city would stand behind him. But if someone else touched him, then it would become someone else's problem. He asked who held the position of operations manager at that branch. They gave him a name. He nodded and said to send it to him. Not to sign anything. Not to leave anything behind. Just let him figure out the rest for himself. On Monday morning, a brown envelope appeared on Garrett Doyle's desk. It had no stamp, no sender's name, and no address. Inside was only a color photograph and a small piece of paper bearing a single word, a family name that people in South Philadelphia didn't speak aloud. He stared at the photograph for a very long time. He recognized the uniform. He recognized the gate of his own building. He sat so still that the hum of the ventilation fan overhead sounded painfully clear. He had been afraid of the wrong thing for weeks. The truth was far worse than anything he had imagined. That same morning, down in the lobby, a middle-aged man in a gray suit entered the bank. He walked quickly, and with purpose, until he looked up and saw the man standing at the gate. He stopped in the middle of a step. Then his shoulders dropped. His head dipped in a swift bow. The kind of bow born from a reflex that had settled deep into the bones, and he immediately turned around and walked back outside, without conducting any business, and without saying a word to anyone. Alessio didn't have time to react. Marisol saw the entire exchange from where she was standing beside the water cooler. At noon, while the two of them sat on the back steps of the building, she asked who the customer from that morning had been, and why he had bowed to Alessio that way before leaving without doing anything. Alessio stopped chewing. He said the man had probably mistaken him for someone else. She asked whether people bowed when they mistook someone for another person. He said that he had once worked as a guard somewhere else, that perhaps the man had passed through there before, and that people sometimes greeted one another out of courtesy. He spoke more slowly than usual, his eyes lowered toward his lunch container, and the moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had told the lie even more clumsily than the last one. Marisol watched him for another moment. She could have asked one more question, only one more. But she didn't. She lifted her bottle, took a drink, then changed the subject, talking about Bev's aching back and the shift changes scheduled for the following week. She had already learned that lesson. 2 years earlier, she had also seen things that didn't fit together. Phone calls that ended abruptly, nights when he came home later than usual, papers he folded and slipped into his pocket whenever he saw her enter the kitchen. Back then, she hadn't asked either, and she had learned that an answer wasn't always something a person could bear. On Thursday evening, Marisol finished her shift at the restaurant earlier than usual after trading hours with a friend, then took the bus down to Snyder Street. The senior community center occupied the ground floor of an old building, its glass doors covered with notices, and inside was a large room lit by white fluorescent lights, several rows of plastic chairs arranged in lines, and a yellowed whiteboard standing in one corner. By the time she walked in, more than a dozen elderly people were already seated there. Every one of them held a stack of papers. Some kept theirs in plastic bags secured with rubber bands. Some carried them in broken file folders whose covers no longer closed, and some had brought entire notebooks filled with ballpoint pen entries, each month carefully separated from the next, the handwriting slanting gently in the manner of people who had learned to write in the days when fountain pens were still used. They sat upright and silent, as though waiting for their names to be called at a clinic. Eunice Hartley rose, clapped her hands twice to get everyone's attention, then said that this was the young woman she had told them about, the one who was willing to sit down and listen. The entire room turned to look at her. Marisol took off her coat, set down her bag, and stood there for several seconds without knowing where to begin. Then she picked up a marker. She said that she wasn't a bank employee, that she had only studied accounting for 3 years before leaving school, so they should question anything they didn't understand, and she would explain whatever she knew. She drew a simple bank statement on the board, divided it into columns, marked each section, then taught them how to read it. This is the date. This is the money coming in. This is the money going out. And this column, the one almost no one notices, contains the fees. She told them to open their own papers, find that exact column, and underline it with a pen. At once, the room filled with the rustling of paper. They bent over their statements, some putting on their glasses, some holding the pages far away before drawing them close again, some asking the person beside them to read because their eyesight was poor. They sat as quietly as first-grade children on the first day of school, and not one person whispered to another. An elderly man in the second row raised his hand, lowered it again, then raised it once more, and when Marisol called on him, he asked, "Dear, may I ask something that is probably very foolish? Does this fee mean I have to pay the bank for keeping my money safe?" He apologized immediately and said that it was a stupid question, and that the others shouldn't laugh. Marisol put down the marker. She said that there were no stupid questions, only people who refused to answer them. The room fell silent for a beat. Then she walked down the aisle, crouched beside the old man's chair, and explained everything again from the beginning just for him. For more than 2 hours after that, she moved from one chair to the next, holding each stack of papers, arranging them by date, underlining entries, and copying notes into a separate notebook of her own. Not one statement had been taken from the bank's internal system. Every page belonged to the elderly customers themselves, papers they had been handed at the counter and carried home to keep inside drawers. When she finished recording the information from the last person, she sat down, looked over her notebook, and felt her hands turn cold. It wasn't happening to everyone, only to the oldest customers, only to those who didn't use mobile banking, those who still came to the branch in person, still waited in line, still carried cash home in their hands. And when she compared the dates, Every one of those transactions had occurred on days when only one particular person had been working in that position. At the back of the room, leaning against the wall beside the door, a man in a baseball cap had been standing there since the meeting began. No one noticed him. They assumed he was someone's son or grandson, waiting to take an elderly relative home. He remained there for more than 2 hours without sitting down or leaving. He had spent a fortune buying the loyalty of the hardest men in the city. Yet she stood there without pay, without authority, without anyone to protect her, armed with nothing but a marker and several dozen elderly people, whom no one had bothered to hear. When the evening ended, a small elderly woman waited until everyone else had left, before approaching Marisol and handing her a plastic container that was still warm, filled with cookies she had baked that afternoon. Marisol refused, telling her to keep them for herself, that she hadn't done anything worth thanking. The old woman pressed the container into her hands and told her to take it. Then she added in a softer voice that it had been an entire month since she had last had someone to bake for. The weather began to turn cold, and with the cold came sudden rains late in the afternoon. That day, the rain started just as Marisol was pushing the garbage cart toward the back of the building, pouring down so quickly that she barely had time to run beneath the narrow awning beside the rear door. Alessio was already standing there, and the two of them remained about an arm's length apart. Watching the white curtain of water beat against the concrete, she laughed and said they would probably have to wait for a while. He didn't laugh. He stared out at the rain for a long time, then said there was something he had wanted to tell her for a long while. She turned toward him. He said he had nothing to give her. No house, no money, nothing worth making promises about. He said all he had was the fact that he was there every day, and if that was enough, then he would be there every day. The rain kept falling. She didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her wet shoes, then said she had been thinking about it too. She said she didn't need a man who had a great deal. She only needed a man who was present. Then she fell silent for another moment, and her voice changed when she continued, saying there was something he needed to know about her first. She told him about Andres. She said they had married when they were both very young, that he had been a good and gentle man who had never once raised his voice at her. There had been a debt, one he had taken on before they married, and he had hidden it from her for nearly 2 years. Interest had piled upon interest. He took a second shift, then a third, leaving before dawn, and coming home when daylight had already returned, sleeping for 3 or 4 hours before going out again. She said she had asked him about it, but he told her the company was busy, and she believed him because she wanted to believe him. Then one morning, someone called her. He had collapsed on his way home from the night shift while waiting for the first bus of the day, and they told her his heart had simply worn itself out. He was 28 years old. She said it wasn't until after the funeral, when she sat down and opened every cabinet and drawer to clear out his belongings, that she discovered the debt and finally understood how her husband had been living through all those months. She said she wasn't angry with him for being poor. She never had been. She said she was angry because she had been forced to learn how to love a man she had never truly known, and she had learned it at his funeral. Alessio stood motionless. Rain blew against his shoulder, but he didn't step back. She turned fully toward him and spoke her final words in a voice so calm that they carried more weight than any sobbing ever could. She said she could spend her entire life in a 30-square-meter apartment, and she could wash dishes until her hands could no longer hold a plate. But she couldn't survive living one more time with a man who lied to her. He opened his mouth. His entire body had prepared itself to speak. He knew exactly what he had to say, knew what the first sentence should be, and he knew that if there had ever been a right moment to tell the truth, this was it, when she had just placed the deepest pain of her life in his hands and stood there waiting for him to answer with something equally true. He opened his mouth, and no sound came out. She watched him and waited. Then he heard himself say that he understood, and that he would never let her go through something like that again. She nodded. She believed him. She reached out her hand, and he took it, and they stood that way until the rain began to ease, neither of them saying anything more. He had sat across from men whose names could make an entire neighborhood lower its voice while passing their homes. He had issued orders in words spoken so softly that people had to lean closer to hear, and they had still obeyed without question. Yet he couldn't bring himself to speak his true name to a woman standing before him, soaked by the rain. The following Monday morning, Marisol knocked on Walter Nash's office door and placed a file on his desk that she had stayed awake several nights to complete. Inside were copies of the statements belonging to the elderly people from Snyder Street, arranged in order, with numbered pages. a date comparison table she had drawn by hand with a ruler, and a summary clearly stating how many accounts contained the recurring fee, which dates it had appeared, and who had been working at that position on those days. She said, "I don't have access to the system. All these papers were given to me by the customers themselves. I only put them in order." Walter put on his glasses and began to read. He read very slowly, turning each page, and when he reached the final sheet, he removed his glasses, placed them on the desk, and sat in silence for a long time. He asked whether she had done all of this alone. She said yes. He asked whether she had told anyone else. She explained that she had already presented it to Mr. Doyle, and that he had told her she had misunderstood how the fees worked. Walter looked at her. He said nothing more about that. He only told her to leave the file with him, and not to mention the matter to anyone else in the building from that moment on. That afternoon, he stayed after work. He had intended to extract the system logs to see who had performed the transactions on those accounts, but when he opened the software, he received only a familiar message stating that the function required branch operations manager authorization. At Fairhaven, the only person with that authority was Garrett Doyle. To investigate him, Walter would have to ask permission from the very man he wanted to investigate. Walter sat before the screen for a long time, tapping his fingers lightly against the desk, then closed the software. He chose another way. He composed a letter addressed directly to headquarters and sent it to the internal complaint mailbox, attaching the entire file after scanning it, writing clearly and methodically, signing his full name, and including his personal telephone number. He didn't send a copy to anyone at the branch. He pressed send, watched the confirmation message appear on the screen, then shut down the computer and went home. What Walter Nash didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that the mailbox had been configured to forward messages years earlier. At the time, Garrett Doyle had also been responsible for the branch's computer systems, and he had created a small rule, a single command no one had ever thought to look for, so that every message sent from the branch to the internal complaint mailbox would first be copied to his private account. He had installed it back when he had nothing to hide, simply because he wanted to know in advance what his superiors were about to hear about him. Walter waited for a reply. The first day passed, then the second, then the entire week. He told himself that headquarters was busy, that matters like this always took time. In the second week, he sent another message to follow up. He waited a total of 10 days. 10 days sitting in his office and opening his inbox every morning before doing anything else, never realizing that he was waiting for an answer from an empty place. Meanwhile, down in the basement, Chelsea Novak showed the entire cleaning crew her new bracelet, raising her wrist so the light would catch it, saying that someone had given it to her because her own wages could never buy anything like that. She glanced toward Marisol, who was changing her gloves, and added that at least she wasn't sharing bread with the gate guard. Marisol didn't answer. She pulled on her gloves, picked up her bucket, and went upstairs. In the office above, after the building had emptied, Garrett Doyle opened his private mailbox and found Walter Nash's letter waiting there. He read it, then he read it a second time. He opened each attachment, enlarged every page, examined the file all the way to the end, then pressed print. The printer whirred inside the darkened room, releasing one page after another, while he sat motionless and watched the stack rise slowly in the tray. He thought about the photograph inside the brown envelope locked in the lowest drawer. He thought about the family name written on the small piece of paper. He thought that he didn't have much time left, perhaps only a few days. Then he pulled his chair closer to the screen, signed in with his administrator account, and opened the transaction management system. The final morning he stood at that gate began like every other morning, with a chill in the air, traffic gradually growing heavier, and no knowledge that the night before, inside the darkened office upstairs, 3 lines of code had been created. 3 small sums of money had been withdrawn from the accounts of 3 elderly customers, whose statements Marisol herself had sat down to help read, then transferred into a single account under the name Marisol Reyes, the exact account number she had provided to the cleaning company, and scheduled to appear during the precise hours when she was present inside the building. That morning, while taking a break between shifts, she opened the banking application on her old phone to see whether the advance payment had arrived. She saw 3 unfamiliar deposits. She tapped each one, checked them again, closed the application, then opened it once more. She stood in the middle of the lobby with the phone in her hand, and in that moment she understood something that sent a chill down her spine. She had no way to prove she hadn't received the money. It was in her account, her name, her account number, and at the recorded time, she had been inside the building. Half an hour later, she was called into the personnel office. Garrett Doyle sat there with a representative from the cleaning company, his voice heavy with regret as he said they had conducted a review, and the findings were deeply unfortunate, that the branch had no choice but to suspend her immediately and forward the matter to the legal department. She said she hadn't taken anything, that she had no idea where those 3 deposits had come from. He nodded and told her she could explain that to the legal department. They asked her to surrender her employee badge. They asked her to open her handbag for inspection. Then they escorted her through the main lobby during the busiest hour of the day, past the rows of waiting chairs, past faces that lifted to look at her and then quickly turned away. When she was almost at the door, Brianna Cole called after her without bothering to lower her voice, saying that she had warned them, that people like that always did things like this. A quiet laugh came from somewhere behind the counter. Only one person followed Marisol all the way out to the sidewalk. Bev Kaminsky carried her cloth bag and walked beside her for the entire distance to the bus stop without saying a single word. She didn't comfort her, didn't ask questions, didn't offer an opinion. She simply carried the bag, waited beside her until the bus arrived, then gave her a gentle pat on the back. That same morning, several blocks away, Salvatore Ricci called Alessio and told him to come home immediately. The DeLucci family had struck back. A warehouse had been sealed, 2 contracts had been canceled on the same day, and Sal's phone had been ringing without pause since the night before. Sal said that if Alessio didn't appear within 24 hours, the entire city would believe there was no one left at the head of the Ferrante family, and once people began to believe that, it would already be too late even if he returned. Alessio left the gate at noon that day. He instructed Frankie Bruno to inform him immediately if anything happened at the bank. That afternoon, when word reached Frankie that a female cleaning worker had been suspended on suspicion of taking money from customers, he picked up the phone. Then he put it down again. He thought about the meeting taking place downstairs, about those 24 hours, about the people waiting to see whether the Ferrante family could still remain standing. Later, he would say that he had been in the middle of a war, that he wasn't going to distract Alessio over a woman who cleaned floors. That night, Marisol sat on the steps outside the clinic, waiting for her mother to finish her appointment. She had lost her job. She was being accused of stealing from the elderly people beside whom she had once sat to help, and the only man she trusted had disappeared at noon, his phone unreachable, without leaving a single message. Thank God Javi was still at school and knew nothing yet. When Isabel came out, Marisol rose to help her, and once mother and daughter were seated on the bench waiting for the bus, she said in a dry, hollow voice, "I did it again, Mama. I fell in love with another man, without knowing who he really was." The news reached Eunice Hartley the following afternoon, when she came to the bank and saw someone else standing where Marisol usually cleaned. She asked what had happened, and the answer came in a single brief sentence that made her reach for the back of a chair to steady herself. She didn't know whom to call. She stood in the middle of the lobby for a long time, her trembling hands opening her purse and then closing it again, until Walter Nash passed by and stopped. He took her into his office, poured her a glass of water, then sat in silence for a very long time. He knew he had sent the letter, and no one had answered. He knew there was no door left for him to open inside that building. At last, he pulled open a drawer, took out the bank transfer documents, turned to the final page, and copied the name and address of the law firm representing the buyer onto a small piece of paper. He slid it across the desk and said, "I don't dare go there myself, ma'am. I have a wife and children, and I'm afraid. But if you go, they'll listen to you, because you're a customer, Mrs." Hartley took the paper, folded it into quarters, and tucked it into her wallet. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual, combed her hair, put on a proper coat, and went to the bus stop. She took 2 buses. She asked for directions 3 times, once at a gas station, once at a coffee shop, and once from a person waiting at a red light. Then she walked a long distance through the cold wind before finally reaching the address. Frankie Bruno was standing at the door and stopped her, saying, "Ma'am, we don't receive walk-in visitors here. Do you have an appointment?" She said, "I don't have an appointment." Then she walked over to a chair in the corner of the lobby, sat down, placed her bag on her lap, and said, "Then I'll sit here. I'll sit here until someone is willing to listen to me." She remained there for more than an hour. She didn't read anything, didn't call anyone, simply sat with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the door. When Salvatore Ricci crossed the lobby and noticed her, he stopped and asked whom she was waiting for. She rose and said, "Young man, that girl didn't take a single cent from me. I'm old, but I'm not confused. I didn't ride 2 buses all the way here to lie to you." Sal took her into the inner office, poured her some tea, and listened as she told the story from the beginning, never interrupting her once. Half an hour later, he called Alessio. That evening, inside the house on Mifflin Street, Alessio stood across from Frankie Bruno. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He only asked, "You knew about this yesterday, didn't you?" Frankie admitted that he did, and began explaining about the war, about the 24 hours, about how he hadn't wanted to distract his boss over a woman who cleaned floors. Alessio allowed him to finish. Then he said, "You decided for me what was worth knowing. From today onward, you won't need to make any decisions at all." Frankie went pale. He opened his mouth to say more, but Sal had already risen from his chair. He looked at Alessio and said, "I warned you. In this very room, in front of a witness, I told you that the moment this game hurt an innocent person, you had to stop. You didn't stop. Now you have to pay." No one answered him. No one in the house slept that night. Ray Alvarez arrived at nearly 11 o'clock, carrying a copy of the footage from the camera he had installed outside the server room, footage showing a man entering that room close to midnight and remaining inside for a very long time. Walter Nash arrived afterward with the entire file Marisol had submitted, a printed copy of the letter he had sent to headquarters, and the forwarding rule he had just discovered. Sal sat at the large table, arranging each stack of documents and preparing for what he and Alessio had discussed that afternoon, the surrender of the family's complete financial records to the financial investigators. Near dawn, after everyone else had gone home, Alessio remained alone to finish examining his father's old ledgers, leather-bound books with peeling corners that he hadn't opened since the funeral. He turned each page and read every slanting line written by the dead man. Then, on page 11, he stopped. He read a name, then read it again, and he remained sitting there until daylight had fully broken. The ceremony introducing the new owner was held on Friday morning. The Fairhaven lobby had been cleaned the night before, chairs arranged in rows, a red backdrop stretched behind the lectern, and several pots of flowers placed on either side of the aisle. 2 reporters from the local newspaper were present, along with representatives of the board of directors, and every employee at the branch stood in lines according to department. Brianna Cole stood in the front row, more carefully groomed than usual, holding a small piece of paper on which she had written the greeting she had been practicing for several days. Just as everyone was waiting, the main doors opened, and Marisol walked in. She hadn't come to attend the ceremony. She wore her old coat and carried an envelope containing her complaint and the employee badge she needed to return. She intended to go straight to the personnel office at the end of the hallway. Garrett Doyle saw her from the lectern. He didn't let her take 3 steps. He spoke loudly, very loudly, so that the entire lobby and both reporters could hear, saying that an employee currently suspended for stealing customer funds was ordered to leave the building immediately. Everyone in the lobby turned around. A camera shutter clicked. Marisol stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, the envelope in her hand, unable to move. Then the sound of brakes came from outside. 2 black cars stopped across the street, not pulling toward the curb, but parking directly in the roadway, as though traffic no longer mattered. The glass doors reflected the shadows of people passing behind them. Before anyone saw who was coming, the entire room heard the sound of shoes striking the marble floor, steady and unhurried, each step echoing through the sudden silence of more than 100 people. Frankie Bruno pushed open the door and entered first. Salvatore Ricci followed half a step behind, carrying a case filled with documents. Then Alessio walked in. No uniform, no name badge, a black suit, a dark tie, his face clean-shaven. Garrett Doyle fell silent in the middle of his sentence. Brianna Cole recognized the face before she even understood what was happening, and the small paper in her hand slipped to the floor, though she didn't bend to pick it up. Alessio walked directly to the center of the lobby. He didn't look at the reporters. He stopped several steps from Garrett and spoke in a voice so quiet that the people at the back of the room had to hold their breath to hear him. He asked, "What did you just call her? Say it again. I want to hear it clearly, because those will be the last words you ever speak inside this building." No one moved. Alessio stepped onto the platform, took the microphone, and said that the ceremony would not proceed according to the printed program. He introduced himself by his full name, slowly and clearly, and a murmur broke across the lobby before dying away just as quickly. He said, "For the past several weeks, I stood at the gate outside. Many people in this room spoke to me. Very few of you spoke to me as though I were a human being. Then Sal opened the document case. The system access logs, which only one person at the branch had the authority to extract, appeared on the screen. The work schedule for each day, the comparison table, based on the statements belonging to the elderly customers from Snyder Street, the letter Walter Nash had sent to headquarters, along with the forwarding rule that had secretly redirected it to a private mailbox for years. And finally, the footage from the camera positioned outside the server room, showing a man opening the door close to midnight and remaining inside for a long time during the exact period when the 3 transfer orders were created. Someone seated among the rows let out a small cry. Alessio looked toward Ray Alvarez, who was standing at the back of the lobby, and thanked him. Then he told everyone that Mr. Alvarez had once worked as a driver for his father many years earlier, before leaving to live an honest life, and that he had recognized Alessio on the very first day simply by the way he stood. He hadn't said a single word to Alessio throughout all those weeks. He had only continued quietly doing his job exactly as he should, and because of that, they had the recording before them that day. At last, Sal extended one hand toward someone seated in the back row. Eunice Hartley rose and walked forward, gripping the edge of the lectern with both hands. She took the microphone, and her hand trembled so badly that the sound of it touching her ring rang clearly through the speakers. She managed to say only one sentence. She said, "I thought I was losing my mind. The girl who cleaned the floors was the only person willing to sit down and let me finish a single sentence." When Mrs. Hartley was helped down from the platform, just as everyone thought the matter was over, Garrett Doyle stepped forward. He didn't bow his head, didn't apologize, didn't look for a path to the door. He walked straight toward the 2 reporters, pulled from his briefcase the color photograph that had been sitting inside the brown envelope for weeks, held it up for the cameras, and said loudly, "Do you know who just bought this bank?" He spoke the family name aloud, pronouncing every syllable clearly, the name people in South Philadelphia didn't say above a whisper, then asked, "Do you know whose pocket your money is sitting in now?" The entire lobby turned toward Alessio. Cameras swung in his direction. Someone in the rows of chairs rose to their feet. Salvatore Ricci stepped half a pace forward as though to shield him, but Alessio raised a hand and stopped him. He took the microphone and did something no one in that room expected. He said Garrett was right. He stated his name again, his full name, without evasion and without offering excuses. Then he said, "You have the right to know that before you place your money in this bank, and you also have the right to know that early this morning, before this ceremony began, I surrendered all of my family's financial records to the federal financial authorities." He said, "I didn't come here to cleanse this name. I came here to bury it." The room fell completely silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking. Sal stood beside him and spoke softly into his ear, quietly enough that only Alessio could hear, saying, "You understand that you have just signed your own sentence, don't you? There will be investigations. There will be losses. There will be things you won't be able to keep, and this will go on for years." Alessio answered just as quietly, "I know." Then he added, "My mother spent more than 20 years cleaning other people's floors. What is a few years spent cleaning my own name?" Sal said nothing more. He stepped back half a pace and stood still. Alessio turned toward the lobby, toward the faces he had passed every morning for so many weeks, and spoke the final thing, the thing he had been thinking about all night. He said, "I entered this building in a security guard's uniform to find the person stealing money from elderly customers inside my own branch. I stood at that gate for weeks. I found nothing. I wasn't the one who discovered the truth. It was found by a woman carrying a mop. A woman with no access to any system, no reward, no protection. And she found it by sitting down and listening to the people you turned away from the counter." He paused for a moment, then said, "And you just called her a thief." Marisol was still standing in the middle of the aisle with the envelope in her hand, and she didn't look toward the platform. The ceremony dissolved into chaos. Garrett Doyle's file was turned over to investigators that same afternoon, along with complete copies of the system logs and the surveillance footage. In the rear hallway, Frankie Bruno pulled Alessio aside and said, "Let me deal with that man the way our family handles things. Give me one day, and no one in this city will ever find him again." Alessio studied him for a long time, then said, "My father would have done exactly what you just suggested, and that is why my mother had to clean floors until she was nearly 60. Frankie fell silent. Alessio told him, "From now on, Whatever belongs to the law will be left to the law, and whatever belongs to us will be done properly. Late that afternoon, when the personnel department submitted a list of employees recommended for disciplinary action, Brianna Cole's name appeared on the first line with a proposal for termination. Alessio crossed it out. He said, "I remember very clearly what she said to me, but if I dismiss her because she humiliated me, that would be revenge, not leadership." He ordered that she be disciplined according to the rules governing the treatment of customers, based on what had happened to Mrs. Hartley and the other elderly clients, with written records, witnesses, and proper procedure. Brianna Cole was removed from her position as head teller, transferred to a lower role, and required to complete the entire customer care program again from the beginning, like an employee on her first day. He found her in the parking lot behind the building, in the exact place where they had once stood talking, beneath that same narrow awning. She was waiting for the last bus of the afternoon, still holding the envelope containing her complaint because there was no one left to submit it to. She didn't thank him. She said nothing about the ceremony, about the words he had spoken before the cameras, or about how her name had just been cleared in front of more than 100 people. She only turned toward him and asked how long he had been standing there. He said, "From the beginning." She nodded slowly, as though she had already known the answer and only needed to hear it confirmed. Then she said, "All those weeks, you watched them humiliate me. You watched them make me clean the same place 3 times in the middle of the lobby. You watched them laugh in my face when I asked for help for my mother, and through all those weeks, you knew exactly who you were." Alessio didn't argue with a single word. He stood there with his arms hanging at his sides and let her finish. Then he said there was one more thing she needed to know, and no one was forcing him to tell her. He explained that the night before, he had gone through his father's old ledgers in preparation for turning them over to the investigators. He told her about a leather-bound book with peeling corners, filled by the slanting handwriting of a dead man. He said that on page 11 of that book, he had seen a name. Then he spoke it aloud. Andres Reyes. Marisol didn't move. The wind swept through the parking lot and made the envelope in her hand rustle, and she didn't even try to hold it still. He continued in the same even voice, saying, "You asked where my money came from. Part of it came from your husband." She didn't cry. That was what frightened him most. She only stood there, staring across the empty lot, and remained that way for so long that a bus passed at the end of the street without her bothering to look up. Then she said in a dry, clear voice, each word separate from the next, "So he worked 3 shifts a day to pay your family." Alessio didn't defend himself. He didn't say that he had been young then, that he hadn't known, that it had been his father's business and not his own. Every one of those things was true, and he didn't say any of them. He only said that that morning he had ordered the entire ledger erased, every remaining debt, every name still written inside it. He said he hadn't done it for her. He had done it for the others in that book, the people still working night shifts somewhere in the city whom he had never met. Marisol turned toward him, and for the first time since he had entered the parking lot, she looked directly into his eyes. She said, "You lied to me." She said, "You knew what I feared more than anything in this world. I told you beneath this awning. I told you something I had never told anyone." And you still stood there and nodded. Then she fell silent for a moment, and her voice dropped when she continued. "But I also chose not to ask. 2 years ago, I did exactly the same thing. I saw everything. The calls that ended the moment I entered the room, the papers he folded and put away when I came into the kitchen, the mornings he came home with his eyes red from exhaustion. I saw all of it, and I stayed silent because I was afraid of the answer." She said, "This time, I saw it too. That customer bowing to you and then running away, the way you lied so badly that day. And I stayed silent again, exactly as I did before." She picked up the envelope, folded it, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She said, "I don't know whether I'm angrier with you or with myself." Then she stepped out from beneath the awning and walked toward the bus stop without looking back. He didn't follow her. He remained there until her figure had disappeared completely around the corner. Salvatore Ricci had warned him from the very beginning, in a room with a witness present, that the moment this game hurt an innocent person, he had to stop. Alessio had heard those words and nodded. He had always imagined that the innocent person who would be hurt would be someone he didn't know. 3 days later, Alessio went to Kensington alone. He didn't take his own car, no one accompanied him, and he climbed 3 flights of stairs on foot before standing outside the door until someone came to open it. There were only 4 plastic chairs in the kitchen, and he sat down on one of them with both hands resting on his knees. Isabel poured him a cup of tea, sat across from him, and didn't waste time circling around the truth. She asked whether he had ever made someone cry to obtain that money. He didn't avoid the question. He told her about his family, about what his father had done and what he himself had done, including the parts that weren't honorable, the ledgers, and the people who had struggled to survive because of the name he carried. Then he told her what he was doing to bring all of it to an end, about the records he had surrendered, the investigation that would last for years, and the things he would lose. Isabel listened to everything without interrupting him, then said, "I can't forgive you on behalf of my daughter, but I recognize that you came here, sat on this plastic chair, and told the truth." The air had grown so heavy that everyone found it difficult to breathe, until Javi stepped out of the bedroom, stared at the old phone lying on the table, and blurted out, "You really use that flip phone? My friends don't even know those things can fold." Everyone laughed, and that laughter made the kitchen feel breathable again. Marisol sat down in the last empty chair. She said, "I forgive you." Then she continued, "But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing." She laid out her conditions clearly, and they weren't open to negotiation. No gifts, no calling every day, no using power or money to get close to her in any way, and she would never accept any position he arranged for her, not a single one. He agreed to everything without bargaining over one condition. Then he said there was still something he hadn't told her, and he spoke about the call that had lasted less than a minute that night, about the assistance program the clinic had announced the following morning. Marisol sat without moving. Then she lowered her head, covered her face with both hands, and cried. It was the first time she had cried in front of anyone since her husband's funeral. 6 months passed after that day. A new foundation was established in the name of Rosaria Ferrante, devoted to protecting elderly people from financial fraud and offering free reviews of bank statements, and the first mandatory line in its operating rules stated that every employee had to sit down and allow each elderly person to finish speaking. Eunice Hartley became a permanent volunteer, sitting at the table beside the entrance and teaching people her own age how to read a fee entry. The branch introduced a new policy, forbidding managers from ordering security guards, cleaners, or drivers to perform personal errands, and allowing contracted workers to submit complaints directly to the personnel department without going through anyone else. Ray Alvarez was promoted to head of security for the entire banking system. Walter Nash became branch director. Chelsea Novak filed a complaint with the authorities, and she fell apart when she discovered that the man had a wife and children. The person who sat with her in the changing room that afternoon was Marisol, and Marisol told her, "I'm not comforting you because you deserve comfort. I'm comforting you because you're in pain." One morning, Marisol passed the teller counter and saw Brianna Cole. Brianna didn't apologize. She wasn't the kind of person who knew how to apologize, and she didn't look toward Marisol either. She only rose when an elderly woman with a cane approached, pulled out a chair, and said, "Please sit here so your legs won't grow tired. Let me take a look at this for you." Marisol stopped for a second, then continued walking. During that same period, she applied for a position in the Internal Control Department, alongside dozens of other candidates, completed 3 rounds of examinations, and earned the job through her own ability in a department that didn't report to Alessio. When the interview panel asked what mattered most when working with customers, she answered that customers wouldn't remember how quickly you solved their problem, but they would remember whether you looked them in the eyes while listening. On the first Saturday afternoon of spring, Alessio asked her to meet him behind the building, beneath the same narrow awning where they had once sheltered from the rain. Isabel was brought there and seated on a chair waiting beneath the awning, her scarf still tied carefully around her neck, both ends hanging at exactly the same length. Alessio handed Marisol a box. She opened it, and there wasn't a ring inside. Inside was the scratched plastic name badge, its silver lettering faded but still clear enough to read the words Al Faro. He said, "This is the man you gave a bottle of water to." He said he had kept it to remind himself that he once believed he was testing the character of other people, when the truth was that they were testing his. Only then did he take out the ring. No false name, no test, nothing hidden. She said yes. From inside the car, Javi shouted so loudly that his voice echoed across the entire courtyard, and Isabel laughed until tears filled her eyes. Outside the gate, Frankie Bruno stood across the street and didn't come inside. Alessio went out and shook his hand. Frankie said, "Your father would never forgive you." Alessio replied. I know, but my mother would. Frankie gave a single nod, then turned and walked away. The following Monday morning, Marisol passed through that gate on her way to work. She stopped beside the new security guard, a middle-aged man who had only been employed there for a few days, and greeted him by his proper name. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. Money has never been the true measure of a human being. Character is. The way a person treats those who can offer them nothing in return reveals who they truly are. A uniform can never define the worth of the person wearing it, and no one deserves to be looked down upon because of the work they do to support their family. Any one of us can become the person who sits down and listens until an elderly person finishes a sentence. And sometimes one very small act of kindness, like handing a bottle of water to someone standing beneath the hot sun, can be enough to change the lives of two people forever. Finally, no matter how great love may be, it can't stand upon a lie, because once trust has been lost, it must be rebuilt from the beginning, little by little, through actions rather than promises. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Alessio and Marisol? What would you have done if you had been in her place that afternoon? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your heart. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next story.